A very good evening. Welcome to this lecture, new lecture in the series of London lectures that we organize in London occasionally within the series of the London lectures on Islamic heritage. Like the previous ones, for those who have been previously, this lecture comes within the Al-Furqan continuous efforts in shedding light into the cumulative efforts of people from different races, religions, cultures, ethnicities and backgrounds in building the common human civilization for the betterment of the humankind. It also comes within the framework of Al-Furqan in trying to highlight some of the international days, not all of them, there are many, that are related mainly to its scope of work and interest. This particular lecture coincides with the International Day for Monuments and Sites, which is celebrated usually on the 18th of April, so in 2 days' time. Before I give the floor to our keynote speaker, Professor Diana Darke, I would like to invite Mr. Sharaf Ahmed Zaki Yamani, our chairman, to welcome you and say a few words. Please, Sharaf.
Thank you, Sally. Esteemed guests, friends of the Foundation, ladies and gentlemen, it gives me great pleasure to welcome you all to this evening's public lecture hosted by the Al-Furqan Islamic Heritage Foundation. We are especially delighted to welcome back Diana Darke, author, historian, and a trusted voice in Middle Eastern heritage, whose insightful scholarship has long revealed the deep and often surprising connection between the Islamic and European architectural tradition. And 2 years ago, if you might remember, Diana captivated us with her lecture on how Islamic architecture shaped Europe, showcasing the hidden influences of Islamic art and design in some of Europe's most celebrated monuments. Tonight she promises to take us a step or two further, not only admiring the beauty of these buildings, but celebrating the hands and revealing the names that have shaped them. In her latest book, Islamesque, she boldly re-examines the term Romanesque, and with compelling storytelling, she reveals the vital yet overlooked role of Muslim artisans in shaping medieval European architecture. I find her message especially important today and beautifully aligns with our mission here at the Foundation. In times when history is often oversimplified or reshaped, Diana's work powerfully reminds us of the richness of our shared past. Islamesque challenges assumptions and shows how deeply connected our cultures have always been, proving that cultural exchange, intellectual collaboration, and artistic ingenuity have always transcended borders. And here at the Al-Furqan Islamic Heritage Foundation, for over 35 years, we have been dedicated to uncovering and preserving the intellectual and artistic contribution from the Muslim world. Much like Diana's work sheds light on the hidden influences of European architecture, our mission is to safeguard and revive the forgotten events, ideas, and innovations that shaped the world we live in today. Architecture, like history, tells a story, not just of power and conquest, but also of knowledge, exchange, and shared human ambition. And by preserving these narratives, we not only help future generations recognize the interconnected nature of our civilizations, but also equip them with a deeper understanding of diversity, mutual respect, and also the value of cultural collaboration. These are qualities essential for building a future that values understanding over division, and builds bridges, hopefully, instead of walls. Personally, reading Islamesque earlier this year left me extremely eager to hear Diana speak again. Her work reshapes our understanding of history, changing the way we even see European monuments, making them even more remarkable once we do recognize the diverse influences behind them. Again, thank you, Diana, for being with us tonight. I know it's been a long trip yesterday, so having you here is especially rewarding for all of us and appreciated. And on behalf of the Al-Furqan Islamic Heritage Foundation, I welcome you all again to tonight's lecture, and I hope you all enjoy it. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Sharaf. As mentioned, although Al-Furqan's main study focus is on the Islamic written heritage, the manuscripts, as you know, but from time to time we do initiate projects and even events that deal with the tangible heritage, different artifacts, including the buildings, and for both of these types of heritage fall within the cultural, the so-called cultural heritage, and they are linked organically with each other, since they both contribute in building the shared human civilization. Throughout the human history, there has been a continuous cultural interdependency in the process of building the joint civilization. Much of inventions and contributions has roots in other cultures, others' culture. Hence, we can easily conclude that the civilization that we see today is a result of the cultural interdependency and an outcome of the contributions of different people and cultures. Our keynote speaker, Diana Darke, will document the many instances of artistic interaction between the Muslim and Christian worlds. Few words about Diana. Diana Darke is a Middle East cultural historian with special focus on Syria. She holds degrees in Arabic from Oxford University and in Islamic art and architecture from SOAS. And she has spent over 40 years specializing in the region, the Middle East region, working for both government and commercial sectors. Among her publications are the highly acclaimed My House in Damascus, an inside view of the Syrian crisis, The Merchant of Syria, and The Ottomans, a Cultural Legacy. Her book, Stealing from the Saracens, How Islamic Architecture Shaped Europe, published by Hearst in 2020, received 3 Book of the Year 2020 awards. And we had the honor to have a lecture about that book 2 years ago, as well, was mentioned by Sharaf. Now, at that time, she did, give us the good news of the new upcoming. It was sort of in its inception phase, the book Islamesque, and here we are. It was published last year. We were keen to launch it last year, but then was pushed to today. So it's an sister volume of the Stealing from Saracens. So Islamesque has been selected by Don'ts as a history and current affairs book of the year 2024. Luckily, we have got a couple of copies outside. Some of you probably had the chance to sign, get the signature of the book, the autograph, and whoever didn't manage to do that, probably after the event you can do that. She's a non-resident scholar at Washington, D.C.'s Middle East Institute, a respected Middle East think tank. In her talk tonight, as I said, entitled Islamesque, Exploring the Influence of Islamic Culture and Craftsmen in European Architecture, Diana Darke will take us on a virtual and visual journey, exploring Europe's medieval architectural wonders by shedding light on the forgotten Muslim master builders and craftsmen that stand behind them, showing how cultures have interacted and intertwined in ways that challenges all kinds of assumptions and stereotypes that sometimes we might have. The main question that she is going to try and answer tonight is who really built Europe's greatest medieval monuments? So look forward to the answer of this tricky and triggering question. Please join me in welcoming Professor Diana Darke to address you to the podium. Thank you, Diana.
thank you very much for those kind words of the introduction, and it's a great pleasure to be here again. Forgive me if I'm a little bit slow or jaded, but I only flew in from Damascus late last night, especially for this lecture, I'll have you know. So the subject matter is something that's permanently in my head, so it's not something that I need to sort of swat up for, if you like. It sort of lives in my head all the time these days, and I notice all the elements that I've been writing about now for the last 4 or 5 years. Everywhere I go, I just constantly notice more and more details which reinforce what I'm talking about. And the reason I reach these conclusions is not because I set out to reach them. All of them have been sort of accidental discoveries, and so I haven't been told, find out this, find out that. It's been a completely personal voyage of discovery where I couldn't possibly, if I'd spent my entire life sitting in a library studying, I could never have made these connections. It's only been through extensive travel and a series of extraordinary coincidences that has enabled me to make the sorts of connections that, for whatever reason, other people haven't made in the past. So it is quite pioneering work, and so inevitably you get pushback from the established art history world, but increasingly I'm finding that my theories are gaining traction, and I'm very happy about that, because I honestly think what I'm talking about is true. So let me just explain the origin then of the two books. That they form a natural pair. Stealing from the Saracens came first and was triggered by the fire at Notre Dame in April 2019, and it was when I saw the world's reaction to that and the whole thing about French identity going up in flames that I thought, wait a minute, don't people realise that most of these things they're talking about in this cathedral are nothing to do with France, that they've actually come in from the Islamic world? And because that didn't seem to be a known fact, it seemed to have sort of got lost somewhere in the mists of history, I felt compelled to write a book about it. So that was the origin of Stealing from the Saracens. And the title, just briefly to explain, stealing from the Saracens. Saracens in Arabic is from the root to steal, saraka. And so sariqeen are people who steal. So it's a deliberate pun. Stealing from the thieves, in other words. So isn't it ridiculous that we call these people thieves when we actually took things from them? And the word Saracens is specifically used because Christopher Wren, when he was building St. Paul's Cathedral, said that he used Saracen vaulting in the dome of St. Paul's because it is the best. And so the cover there shows the inside of the dome of St. Paul's Cathedral. So I never planned to write another book. I thought Stealing from the Saracens was it. In a nutshell, it's the Islamic backstory of Gothic architecture. But then, completely by chance, I had a eureka moment about the zigzag. And just to explain about the zigzag, so 20 years ago I bought my house in Damascus, a beautiful old courtyard house, and embarked on a 3-year restoration project on it with a Syrian architect and a team of 15 Syrian craftsmen. And it was that led me into the whole architecture field that I now seem to be a bit obsessed with. But without buying that house, there is no doubt that I wouldn't have been writing any of these things. And one of the things in my house that always intrigued me was this zigzag pattern, which runs around the courtyard, runs all the way round and then disappears. And everyone I asked about it, what is this zigzag? What's it all about? You know, it must be trying to say something. And nobody could tell me. Absolutely nobody had any idea. They just thought, well, it's just some sort of old pattern. And then, by pure chance, my brother suggested I should watch a BBC documentary called The Secret History of Writing, which I then watched, and the opening scene of it, the presenter is walking up to this place, which I immediately recognised because I spent 4 years posted in Cairo, and I recognised this as being in the Sinai Peninsula, the Temple of Hathor near the turquoise mines in northern Sinai. And you'll see there on that on this hieroglyphic stela, you can see the zigzag 3 times there. 1, 2, and 3 there. And what the presenter in the documentary explains is that it was here that the Canaanite immigrant labourers who were working for the pharaohs as miners in the turquoise mines developed here the very first phonetic alphabet, and their scribbles are on the rocks nearby. And what they did was, from the hieroglyphs, from the ancient Egyptian hieroglyphs, they took sounds, phonetic sounds, which are the origin of all our alphabets. Everything in the world derives from these early, it's called Proto-Canaanite or Proto-Sinaitic. And the sign, they took that sign there, which in hieroglyphic, ancient pharaonic hieroglyphs means water. And they took that as the sound m, because maya, everything to do with water in that part of the world, in Aramaic, in Hebrew, in Arabic, begins with m. And if you think about it, even our letter M is a bit like a small zigzag. So, of course, that was my eureka moment. Of course, this is water flowing around my courtyard. And if you look there, not only that, but look, it's coming out of a spring. Very clearly, it's coming out of this circle, and it's flowing off all the way around my courtyard, and then it disappears into infinity on the other side of the Iwan. And this is the case in every single Ottoman house in Old Damascus. And actually, just now, while I was in Damascus, I had a secondary eureka moment, which I'll share with you, because I think only in Damascus do these zigzags have this circle of the spring, and that's because only in Damascus do they have Ain Fijr, the spring which feeds Damascus with its drinking water. And so I actually think that the reason this occurs in all Damascene houses is because this is representing Ain Fijr, the spring. All the water is then coming and flowing around every house. And indeed, all these houses had flowing water all the time, in and out of every house, continuously then in the fountain. The water system in Damascus is truly astonishing. So that's it. The zigzag is water. So now that I understood that, of course, you start to see things differently. And you see here, this is the facade of the Umayyad Palace, Qasr Mushatta. It's actually in Berlin, in the Pergamon Museum. And look at the zigzag there, running across the facade. And it's feeding, this is water, feeding all the foliage and plant life and animal life, which is depicted there in all the sculpture around there. It's absolutely obvious once you see it. And what's more, all public fountains, the salsabil as they're called in the Islamic world, where the water runs down the surface, is always carved with a zigzag on the marble or whatever the stone is. And here it is in a representation on the ceiling of the Cappella Palatina in Sicily, in Palermo. This is the private chapel of Roger II. And the people who did this extraordinary ceiling there were brought in from Fatimid Egypt, and so the craftsmen were Muslim, and they show, without even giving it a second thought, because it's what is just basic and obvious to anybody who is from working with this sort of understanding of the symbols, that this is water, and that this is the fountain, and the water's coming out there of the sort of head of the lion. So it's depicted there, and then in Sicily, of course, the Normans conquer Sicily. It's been under Arab control for the best part of 300 years. But when the Normans come, they, of course, inherit all the traditions, the building traditions of the local people, and they are top craftsmen, these people. They are absolutely top craftsmen. And so this is the cloister of the Benedictine monastery of Monreale, just outside Palermo, and it's covered in zigzags. Look at the zigzags running down these columns, and there's a little fountain here in the corner which is also carved with zigzags. And then the Normans come back to this country, and in this country Romanesque architecture is called Norman architecture, so it's the Normans that get credited with everything. And look what happens in Durham Cathedral. Lo and behold, these zigzags appear on the columns of Durham Cathedral, and it becomes the Norman zigzag. You look at any Romanesque history of art book and it will tell you the Normans invented the zigzag. So this is the starting point, really. So when I realised that, I thought, oh my goodness, what if the zigzags are just the tip of the iceberg? What about all the other characteristics that get called Romanesque? Can they likewise be tracked back to things in the Islamic world? So this is the starting point of the book. And incidentally, while we're looking at that slide, the other thing that's striking here is this is the earliest ribbed vault in Britain, basically. And again, only Muslim craftsmen had that knowledge, as I'll explain, to do stone vaulting like that. So zigzags and the vaulting appear there together, and the timing is critical because this is just a handful of years after the First Crusade, and local tradition in Durham has it. As I know a stonemason who did his apprenticeship there, and he told me that according to local tradition, it's sort of a story that's been passed down that Muslims were brought back from the Crusade by Crusader knights, and their skills were used to build Durham Cathedral. So my starting point really is now the Romanesque cathedrals of Europe. These two happen to be in Britain. We've got Ely there on the left and Lincoln on the right. And the thing to realise is that these cathedrals represent the absolute peak of innovation and technology for the time. And the critical year that we're talking about really is the year 1100. Everything changed in the year around about 1100. And of course the First Crusade was just a handful of years before that, 1096. But the other critical thing that happened round about then was that the caliphate in Andalusia, in Al-Andalus, in Spain and Portugal, began to collapse, and the Norman conquest of Sicily. So the Muslim star, if you like, in Europe was on the decline, and the Christian star was on the rise at around about that time. But when you look at the sort of standard Romanesque history books, what they'll tell you is that round about the year 1100 there was this wonderful flowering of magnificent architecture in the cathedrals all across Europe. And what isn't it incredible? As if it was some kind of sort of virgin birth, that just popped out like that. But they never give any explanation. And so my explanation is both political, in that, the timing then is absolutely key, and geographical, as I'm going to explain. So geometry, in Europe, geometry was not well understood at this time, round about the year 1100. It was not common knowledge at all. Round about the year 1200, you start to get this kind of image appearing in, this is actually the frontispiece of a French Bible, showing God as architect of the universe with his compasses there. So again, a sort of representation of geometry. So it comes into the consciousness of Latin Christendom at around this time, the power of geometry. And you get medieval manuscripts like this one. This is a woman, a personification of of geometry, giving a lesson to her students. This is the sort of thing that begins to appear then in early medieval manuscripts. But where did that come from, this knowledge of geometry? Well, the first example of a ribbed vault where the knowledge of geometry is absolutely key is in Cordova, the capital of the Umayyad Caliphate. Don't forget that the Umayyad Caliphate in Cordova, they had come from Damascus. They were expelled from Damascus, and one prince made it, Abdurrahman, made it across to Andalusia and set up the Cordova Caliphate there. But this example here, so this is a 10th century stone vault dome above the mihrab in the Cordova Mesquita. So this dome was examined only a handful of years ago by a pair of Spanish structural engineers who got special permission to go in and take soundings. And they wrote a report saying that they were absolutely flabbergasted at the level of geometric understanding that it showed. They said they had never seen anything so perfect, and it has never required any structural repair in its entire 1,000 years of existence. So that's telling you that these people were absolutely at the top of their game in the 10th century. I mean, the Muslim world at this point was 200 years ahead of anything in Europe in terms of the understanding that these people had and the knowledge, and they were literate. At the back, on the back wall of the Cordova Mesquita, these are the masons' marks that were found during a renovation, and they're all Arabic names, Arabic craftsmen writing their names in cursive Arabic script. No European craftsman could do that at that time. I mean, they could barely do sort of simple straight line strokes, for Roman numerals, which is just straight lines. So this is the back wall of the Cordova Mesquita, and so in Cordova, in the 10th century mosque. These all date from the 10th century. They're labelled underneath. And not only were they literate, but they were also numerate. And of course, the reason for this is that in Cordova alone, I read in an academic text that there were something like, well over 100 madrasas. And of course, they had schools attached. So it was normal for the general population to become numerate and literate from quite an early age. None of that existed in Europe. I mean, only the clergy, the top clergy, were able to read and write. And these Arabic numerals here are actually in this country in a very early palace that was built in the 1200s. And in the 1200s, Arabic numerals had not come to Britain. Britain didn't start using Arabic numerals until the 1500s. So this is 300 years ahead of the use of Arabic numerals. So who could possibly have been using these except Arabs, Arab carpenters who were coming over? And where you find these Arabic numerals, they're used incidentally as assembly marks. It's always in the top buildings. So, for example, they've been found in Salisbury Cathedral, which is often cited as an example of absolute peak craftsmanship, and in bishops' palaces. So it's always the absolute top buildings. So again, this is telling you something. Wells Cathedral, the famous west facade of Wells Cathedral, often cited as one of the most beautiful examples of sculpture in the country. And yet, they have found Arabic numerals, again, on the bases of the statues in this, what's called the resurrection tier up there. And there's a very interesting story behind that, which I had great fun uncovering with the help of the archivist at Wells Cathedral. I mean, you have to read the book because it will take me 10 minutes to explain it, but it's a bit like a sort of detective story, but it all goes back to a legal dispute about who would become the next bishop after the bishop died. But basically what the story proves is that the people who carved these statues were Arabs, and they labelled them up with Arabic numerals because all the work stopped because of the court case, and they went off to a new job. And then local people came 15 years later. It took 15 years in Rome to settle the case. So by that time, the local people didn't know how to put the statues back in the right niches. To them, the Arabic numerals were just a series of incomprehensible hieroglyphs. So they put them back in all the wrong niches and tried to fiddle with they adjusted the shapes and everything, made a complete mess of it basically, and nobody's been able to unravel why on earth that was. So as I said, I feel I was the first to get truly to the bottom of all of that and explain it, because had they been correctly put where the original Arab sculptors had intended them to be put, they would all have fitted perfectly into their niches. But the local builders and masons didn't understand the labelling on them. So going further afield now into Europe, you see other signs that are classified as Romanesque architecture. So here you have these interlocking arches. Now this happens to be a cloister in a monastery in a place called Syria, which is in northern Spain, which is just one of the more elaborate examples. Very, very complex piece of sculpture there. And in the Cordoba Mesquita, again, on the outside walls, so this is 10th century, you've got the same interlocking arches there. And then here on the left, it appears in Durham Cathedral again. So they're bringing in these styles. This is the Galilee Chapel in Durham Cathedral. So now the other thing in Romanesque is this use of fantastical creatures. So again, I started to look into that. And on the left there, this is from the Cordova Caliphate. It dates to the 10th century again, and it's an ivory pyxis, it's called, with incredibly elaborate carving of fantastical creatures, and they've got this beading around them. And again, it's always this idea of twisting foliage, everything tangled up in foliage with endlessly, the movement is everywhere. The sort of sense of nature moving and growing is very strong in all these early Islamic 10th century examples that you see everywhere. In Fatimid Egypt, this is in the centre here, you get this use of paired fantastical creatures again. So these are sort of mermaid-like creatures, and they're always either back to back or confronted face to face. And again, always in sort of medallions, always in frames. Everything is always in frames. And particularly this beaded framing that I began to notice everywhere. And then here on the right, this is Lincoln Cathedral. On the west front, you've got the beading that I began to notice everywhere, all around the medallion. You've got the confronted fantastical beasts that don't exist. You know, there are these creatures they're not real. They're just completely imaginary, but they all derive from early Middle Eastern prototypes, you know, going right back to Assyrian or ancient Egypt, again, which can be traced. So again, this use of fantastical beasts is quite strong, and it finds its way into the cathedrals. Then, when you start to look at the woodwork, it's the same story. This is the restored ceiling of the Cordova Mesquita, and you see the pattern, probably too far away, but it's full of the beaded frames there, beaded medallions linking, and then everything is in frames, very elaborate patterns, very typical of woodwork of the time. And then this is an example from Fatimid Egypt again, the same thing. So again, this is already on European soil, and then this kind of woodwork on the right is what finds its way into Sicily. So it finds its way into, again, you've got the two beasts there, very, very typical examples. And then when you find medieval wooden ceilings of cathedrals, you see the same thing again. So here on the left, this is the only surviving medieval wooden ceiling, and it's in Peterborough Cathedral, and the design is very geometric in these classic lozenge shapes which you get everywhere in Islamic architecture, and each lozenge has got 7 frames, 3 of which are zigzags. So again, the geometric knowledge to put this thing to get up there in the first place, I mean, even the techniques that are used with the woodwork, I've examined it, and it's almost identical to the techniques that were used in the Cordoba Mesquita. So this is craftsmen at the absolute peak of their their expertise as carpenters. And in the one on the right here is in Germany, Hildesheim. There are only 3 in, so there's Peterborough, there's Hildesheim in Germany, and there's one other in Switzerland, in a little village called Sillis. The only 3 medieval wooden ceilings that are left, because of course they get destroyed in fire. And then they build them in stone after that. But again, Hildesheim, it's the same thing, very geometrically formed, medallions down the side, everything in frames, the lozenge shape, the circles, these quatrefoils. It's stuff that's all come in from the Islamic world. This one happens to be in Italy. This is the Cathedral of Troia, down in Puglia, and again, incredibly geometric rose window. It's got 11 spokes, quite phenomenal. Each the marble carving within each segment is completely different. You never get anything repeated, and again, this is very characteristic of Islamic art. There's no use of symmetry. It's very striking, and I think this is because with Islamic architecture, there's a desire. I mean, nature is not symmetrical, and what I've observed is that there seems to be a sort of a rhythmic pattern in Islamic art and architecture that is trying to mimic nature, the wonders of nature, and nature. Each leaf is different, if you like. So you don't keep repeating the same pattern. So it's the complete opposite of the classical approach, if you like, where everything has to be symmetrical. And then, of course, these rose windows appear in all the cathedrals. This one is in Notre Dame, the north window, and again, totally geometric shape everywhere. And of course, it's not just the geometry of it all, but the glass itself. The glass, huge quantities of it shipped in from Syria, because Syrian glass was the absolute best at that time. And the Crusaders, once they took that coastal strip there along the eastern Mediterranean, and they realised that quite quickly, and they shipped huge quantities of Syrian glass out as ballast in ships back to Europe, where it found its way into stained glass windows, and some of them have been analysed, and they've been found to have what they call the Islamic composition, because they can tell from the ingredients where they've come from. And the Syrian glass is exceptional, and remains exceptional until the Venetians steal the recipe and make it into a monopoly on Murano Island. But the Venetian recipes even still specify that they want what they call cinders of Syria to make the absolute best glass, and they've still got the monopoly on Murano Island. So Notre Dame. I mean, my theory is that one of the reasons the stained glass, did not perish in the fire was because of this extraordinary Syrian glass, which is very strong because it's so organic and it's got these bubbles in it, which make it really pliable. It can expand and contract. So it's astonishing that the glass basically survived. And this is obviously what Notre Dame looks like now. But then the third element. So we've looked at the stonemasonry, the carpentry. The third element that was dominated by the Muslim world at this time was metalworking, and the reason that the Notre Dame walls didn't collapse was because at the top what they found was these huge brackets, these metal, like a huge stapler on the top of the walls, tying them in. And this knowledge of metalwork, so when the Umayyads came into the Iberian Peninsula, the Visigoths had allowed the mining industry to lapse under the 300 years that they were in charge. Before that, the Romans had been mining. So it was in a state of decay. The Arabs came in and immediately revived the mining industry. This is one of the mines that still can be seen now, and they've got Arabic names, very strikingly. They all start with Al something, you know, it's very obvious that they've still got their Arabic names. And just to show you an example of the sort of high level of metalwork craftsmanship that existed so long ago. I mean, this again is 8th century. This is an Umayyad coal brazier for, for heating, basically, in a bathhouse. And look, you've got the beading here in the sort of series of arcades running around. And the whole thing is exceptionally beautiful and well crafted. And the other thing that gave them the edge with the mining was the technical know-how. So this is a pump that was designed by Al-Jazairi, and with the mining, because of pumps like this, they were able to take out the noxious gases from when they were digging and replace it with pure air, and also to take out water that was down underground, that was, blocking their access. So because of this high level of technology, Arab metalwork became famous all the way across the Mediterranean, basically. Again, they were way ahead of anything that Europe could do. So they transformed the metalworking industry in Europe, quite apart from, of course, the agricultural side of things, because of their knowledge of water wheels and everything. So when they came in to Andalusia, there was one crop a year at most. But because of their ability to harness water and to irrigate well, I mean, they were producing at least three crops a year. And so this, again, produced massive wealth for the country. I mean, so everything flourished, and the levels of civilization rose very fast. So the use here of these water wheels and forges is what you then start to see in the monasteries when the Christians begin their reconquest of Al-Andalus. It's called the Reconquista, as I'm sure you know, and it goes on over a number of at least 2 or 3 centuries. But so as that knowledge is acquired from the indigenous Muslim population, it starts to appear then in monasteries, because of course only the monasteries have got the money to invest in the new mining. So the Cistercians become the ones who have this reputation for being able to really have very high levels of metalwork and understandings of water systems. But again, where did they get that from? Well, the only people who had it at that time were the indigenous Muslim population. So they employed the top Muslim people and got them to build these things for them. And when they didn't do that, it was quite amusing actually, because sometimes with the Reconquista, they would conquer areas and wouldn't understand the water system at all. And so the monastery would take all the water, basically. The top people would take all the water, and then everything would run dry, and they didn't understand why. And in the end, the rulers were having to issue edicts saying, bring somebody who understands and who can make the water run as it did in the time of the Moors. These are little snippets that are actually recorded and have been dug out by various academics. So I've had great fun, as I said, sort of finding all these wonderful nuggets, because scholars, have devoted their lives to studying how Muslim society worked in Spain and Portugal at that time, but nobody sort of made the bigger connections from that to what the effect of it all then was. So here's an example. This one happens to be in Germany now. We've got the 3 elements. You've got the stone, the wood and the metalwork all combined in the main entrance of, it's called Maulbronn, and again it's a Cistercian monastery in southern Germany. And it just shows you again how the Muslim world dominated all three areas of the construction world at this time. And again, we're talking this critical time round about 1100 when all the cathedrals are built in that next period. And also in Maulbronn, the local leaflet tells you that there's this mysterious sign that nobody understands, quite high up, under the area which they actually call the paradise. It's sort of the foyer, the sort of entrance lobby area into the cathedral. But in my view, it's a crescent moon, and you see the crescent moon again in area. Can you see it down there? And then there's the sun, and there's the crescent moons there, and the 8-pointed star here. This incredibly geometric rose window here, you might assume is from some Islamic monument. It's actually from the Basilica of Santiago de Compostela. It is what they call the mirror. It's used as the symbol of the city of Santiago. And again, they'll tell you that the person who built it was this person called Master Matteo. And again, the names is a whole other story, because what I've managed to find out is that you can't tell anything from the names, basically, because again, it's recorded in things like legal documents. For example, in Sicily, it says things like Roger, who was once Ahmed, because people convert and they take on a different name. I mean, also in Sicily, there are Christians called Muhammad back at that time. Then you get mixed marriages, Muslim, Christian, and the children could be anything. They sometimes have Christian names, sometimes have Muslim names. The whole thing is a complete mess, basically. You can't tell anything. And then there's also the factor that obviously if a Muslim comes as a newcomer into an area and is now working for new Christian masters, and his Christian, the people he's now working for can't pronounce his name, and it means nothing to them, so he adopts a sort of nickname or a local name that makes him fit in better, just as Polish workers do now. Sort of coming over here, so we've got some unpronounceable name, so he gets nicknamed, whatever, John or Ben or whatever seems closest. So the names tell you nothing. So just because this person is called Master Matteo means nothing. I mean, in my view, looking at his work, he must, at the very least, have been schooled in the Islamic tradition because of the work he's producing. And yet, this Santiago de Compostela is, Europe's most famous pilgrimage site, run by the Benedictines. So in the heart of Latin Christendom, you've got a very clear example of a piece of Muslim craftsmanship. Here are a couple more examples from Spain. So here, this is also a Cistercian monastery called Poblet in northern Spain, and this is the thing which the monks wash their hands in on their way to go and eat in their refectory. But again, it just looks like an ablutions fountain. I mean, it's and you've got the lozenge shape here, and the way the columns, the clusters of columns down there, all these elegant columns. The one on the right is Lerida, also in northern Spain, in Catalonia. You've got the slender columns, you've got the complete lack of symmetry, something different in each arch, all the different shapes, exactly the same patterns. You'll see them all over earlier Islamic architecture, and then here they are appearing, in the following century in Romanesque cathedrals. This is now in France, the cloister of Moissac, which was the number 2 most powerful Benedictine monastery after Cluny back then. Again, you've got the slender columns, you've got the fantastical beasts up on the capitals there, you've got the lozenge shapes there. I mean, it's all so clearly, all the elements have been taken in from Islamic architecture. This is in France, in Clermont-Ferrand, in the Massif Central, where the local basilica, 8-pointed stars running all around it, and the ablak, which is again a very Umayyad thing, the black limestone, the black basalt and the white limestone, side by side. Again, you look at it and you'd think it was, it just does not look European. It's just sort of so clear, really. And then you get other structural elements that have come into Romanesque architecture, which are interesting. So beyond the decorative things, you get these structural things. So on the left here, this is Kalat Beni Hamad in northern, in Algeria. So this is very early. This is early 10th century, and the way it gets lighter and lighter as it goes up. So you get more and more windows and blind niches as you go up, and then all these elements start to come into bell towers in Europe, where you get, again, more and more windows as you go up. And the reason for that is you want to lighten the load as it gets taller for structural stability. And the theory is that this was because of earthquakes. They had to, it was a kind of built-in technique to make the building more stable in the event of earthquakes. And another earthquake technique, very Islamic. You see it first in the Islamic world. This is one of the Fatimid gates in Cairo, Bab al-Nasr. And look at these, what's called a joggled voussoir. You see the lintel there is the pieces of masonry are like jigsaws. They interlock. They're not just straight. They interlock like pieces of jigsaw, and that gives it huge stability. So if there's an earthquake, it's much more likely to hold because it will be able to move a bit than it would just collapse if it was a straightforward lintel. And then you starts to appear in other places, like this is Mont Saint-Michel in France. The same thing across there. There's one example in this country that I've been able to find in Rochester Cathedral. Then you get this pattern here, which gets called Venetian dentil in Romanesque architecture. But this is the Ribat of Sousse, where you see it 2 centuries earlier in North Africa. This is Al-Azhar in Cairo. Again, the 10th century arcades and slender columns of the courtyard, and these patterns, circles and lozenges and frames, then start to appear in cathedrals. This one happens to be Speyer, so you've got this Venetian dentil starts to creep in, and then you've got the arcades, the dwarf arcades that go around. This happens to be in Germany, where again this is Maria Laach Abbey. Here again you've got the Venetian dentil running across. This is also called the Paradise, and there's a little fountain in the front there, so it's just like a little courtyard, sort of almost like a mini ablutions area before entering the mosque. Instead it's in front of the cathedral. Got lozenge shapes there and quatrefoils again. But it's not just big cathedrals. You also get these patterns cropping up in this country in tiny village parish churches. So this one is in Kilpeck in Herefordshire, where again, completely out of context and nothing else like it in the area at all. So it's just a tiny village, and yet look at this elaborate stonework here. You've got the zigzags running across the lintel. You've got the tree of life in the centre there with beading running around, and you've got the pine kernel there, and a very deeply carved foliage in a very typical Fatimid style. You've got fantastical animals all going around everywhere. I mean, there's nothing to do with Christianity in that, is there? I mean, there's nothing whatever to do with Christianity in any of that. And because the clergy were so perplexed by this in Romanesque architecture, they tried to come up with all sorts of rather preposterous explanations of what these things were. So this is in the crypt of Canterbury Cathedral, where you've got fantastical animals playing musical instruments. And again, what is going on here? The Bernard of Clairvaux, who is one of the people who founded the Cistercians, actually has a sort of famous rant that often gets quoted, where he sort of throws up his hands in horror and says, "What are these crazy animals doing in our cloisters where we want to be peaceful and say our prayers? Why are these these ridiculous apes and you know, what are they doing there distracting us? So clearly the clergy had no idea what these things were doing there. They simply, they didn't ask for them to be put there. But my view is that the people working here, because this is top quality craftsmanship for the time, really, really excellent stonemasonry and sculpture, is that these were Muslims at the top of their trade, but now working for new Christian masters, but bringing in things from their own tradition and representing them in a Christian context. So, but just to show you how this kind of thing goes back into Islamic tradition. So on the left there, this is from a wall fresco in Qasr Amra in modern Jordan, an Umayyad palace. And it's a bear playing a lute in a lozenge frame there. And again, these sorts of scenes are really very common in secular settings. We have to remember that the representation of humans and animals is only not used in a Muslim context, in a mosque, in a religious context. But in the caliph's palace, it was fine to represent this sort of thing, and all these scenes are basically of courtly entertainment for the caliph. So here, this is from the Capella Palatina, a woman musician here playing a sort of oud thing. So it was completely normal to have these scenes. I mean, Muslim craftsmen were familiar with this kind of thing. They knew how to paint people, how to carve people. They just didn't do it in a religious context. But here, this is from the Alhambra. This is in the Hall of Kings, so again a secular setting. And when you look at the people there, you know, they're very animated. You've always got this movement. You know, they've all got different expressions. They're doing things. They're talking to each other, and you don't get that in Byzantine. You know, sometimes people say to me, "Oh, well, surely it's all just Byzantine." And I said, "Look, it's completely different. You know, Byzantine art is very static. You know, you always get the same saints staring out at you. You know, with those beseeching eyes. They don't move. They don't do things. They just sort of look completely wooden. So this is completely different kind of style. But then you get it. So this is on the facade of the Basilica of Santiago de Compostela. This is the 24 Elders of the Apocalypse, as the scene is known, where all the people underneath, they look very similar to my eye to those earlier ones of like kings, basically, and they're all holding a musical instrument. Some of those musical instruments have been identified as ones that were in existence in the Islamic, in the caliph's court. Basically, they've all got different facial expressions. I mean, it's not typical of how art was in the rest of Latin Christendom. The English coat of arms of the lion. So this is Richard the Lionheart's coat of arms. That lion is an exact copy of the Fatimid lion that was used in their standard. And again, you know, Richard obviously saw it in use when he went on crusade and adopted it. The lion had been long extinct in Europe by that stage. So, but the symbol of the lion as a ruler, as a powerful person, had obviously, you know, he rather appealed to him. So, of course, this became the English standard. So, but it's a direct borrowing from that part of the world. And again, Canterbury Cathedral here, you've got another lion spewing out endless foliage. Very typical design. And then the final example, because frankly, you know, there's just so many. I mean, my problem with this book was to compress it into one book. There is just so much. But this is the final example I'm going to show you. This is Fatimid Egypt. This is the Mosque of Al-Hakim, and this is the sort of porch, if you like, entranceway. And you've got these tall blind arches, which are very typical of Islamic architecture at this time. So we're talking 10th, 11th century, with the lozenge there in the centre as a decorative feature. And then you've got the Tower of Pisa, where you've got the same thing. You've got the tall blind arch, and you've got the lozenge there in the section. And the thing is timing. So this was built just a decade after the Pisans captured Palermo. And there was no school of architecture in Pisa before this at all. There was nothing similar. So suddenly this pops out. What's that telling you? That they must have taken some craftsmen from Palermo who were then employed working for new Christian masters. It's the only explanation, because you can't just suddenly tell your local builder, oh, go and make me that. You know, it's just not going to be up to it. So this is the whole thing, really. I mean, the point is that what I'm trying to say is I'm challenging the notion of Romanesque and saying it should be called, if we're going to label it anything, it should be called Islamesque. The term Romanesque, by the way, was only invented in the 19th century by a pair of French art historians, so the whole thing is, you know, is questionable anyway. But what I'm really trying to say, because Romanesque is always credited as the great foundation on which then Gothic and the Renaissance and everything that came after was built, and I'm basically saying that it was the Muslim world that gave Europe that essential springboard, that essential foundation from which it was able to develop then all the later things of Gothic as the skills gradually passed over, which took about 200 to 300 years, according to my studies. But so it's a fascinating subject, and I'm sorry I've probably overrun my time horribly. But anyway, I hope that all made sense, and I'd be very happy to answer any questions.
Thank you so much, Professor Diana, for this fascinating talk. I would wish that she carried on even further, but obviously she must be tired by now. We'll let her sit. We will open the door for Q&As now. Probably in 15-20 minutes we'll try to wrap it up. There will be a mic that will be going around. The raised hands, I'll start with the gentleman over there, was the first one, and then the next one. Just over there, the gentleman.
I wished that the introduction was a little bit shorter, the introduction. Second point, did you think to present this in the BBC or in the main television? And the third point, a few days ago I heard that the word the tail in English is coming from Arabic, dhail.
Well,
So I mean the influence also in language, not only in architecture.
Yes. I think the most wonderful example of us using an Arabic word actually recently is tariff. I mean, Trump's tariffs, you know, is Arabic, isn't it? I mean, it's you know, if only he knew. You know. As to the question about the BBC, well, I mean, I have to wait for that sort of thing to happen. I just can't put up my hand and say, hey, BBC, you know, why don't you do this? Because, you know, they have their own people. They find their. I mean, what happened with Stealing from the Saracens was, you know, it takes a while for these things to get picked up, and then it acquires a certain sort of momentum. So, I mean, for example, later this month, I've been invited to speak at Christie's at their auction. It's a sort of part of an event for the auction of Islamic art that they're doing, and I'm meant to speak about the connections between Islamic art and Europe. And I mean, to my mind, that means, wow, you know, they're accepting me into the mainstream of, you know, I mean, they're accepting that there is a new way of looking at Islamic art and its effects on Europe, because by and large the two things tend to stay very separate. You know, you've got your Islamic art scholars and you've got your European art scholars, and there's, you know, they stay in their boxes. I mean, this is the trouble with academia, I'm afraid. It very often, it's the nature of the way it's structured that you almost forces people to stay in their little qasr, you know, and defending their castle. And as a result, they're not open to other connections. You know, as I said at the beginning, I would never have made any of these connections if I'd sat in a library and studied all my life. it's because, of being out and doing things like the restoration of my house, practical stuff, and just travelling a lot and noticing things and then just making connections, really. I mean, I felt like a detective a lot of the time, because once you're tuned into it, I mean, the buildings speak for themselves, is ultimately my argument. Once you don't, the fact that it doesn't say in some document this building was built by Muslims, of course you're not going to find that. All that ever happens in the records of Christianity is that the bishop gets mentioned. The Bishop X built this cathedral, and that's it. As to the people, the actual craftsmen, it's always anonymous, until, as you get into the Gothic period, you start to get a few names, all of which, of course, appear to be Christian. So, again, that in itself is sort of telling you something, actually.
My question was related to that.
If you don't mind, just whoever asks or comments, if you introduce yourself for recording purposes.
Okay, yeah, that's fine, yeah. My name is Rizwan, and I do a lot of interfaith work with the South London Interfaith Group and Faith Together in Croydon. So your talk actually has been very insightful. It's something that I can share with our interfaith group composed of different people from different religions. My question actually relates to the names, because which you partly answered actually, because as you said, most of the time with craftsmen, the names are not recorded. But I just wondered, as part of your ongoing research work, or is it possible to actually find these names somehow? Like you have the National Portrait Gallery, a famous Muslim from 16th century, that was found. So I just wondered whether there might be a way to get some records and look into the records. There might be like a guild of craftsmen or something, as there used to be in the Islamic world, similar kind of institutions, and whether there's any, we've got the Doomsday Book, etc., which is 1,000 years old. So there might be some records somewhere that could perhaps.
In theory, yes. The period you're talking about is already very late, compared to, I'm looking, as I said, sort of, 11th and 12th century as the sort of key times, and there isn't basically nothing recorded about the names there that has been found so far. Later, as you get into the 14th, 15th and 16th century, it becomes, much more common for craftsmen to sign their names on things. But in these early periods, it doesn't seem to happen. As to the guilds, now that's a whole fascinating area too, because as you rightly say, there were Islamic guilds. There were Byzantine guilds before that too, so the whole system wasn't invented by Muslims, but it's been studied quite extensively in Andalusia, and the Muslim guilds there were open to everybody, and the same in Fatimid Egypt. So it didn't matter whether you were Muslim, Christian, or Jewish. You could belong to the guild if you were skilled in that area. What happened then in the Reconquista was that the Christians made their own guilds then, as they started to acquire the skills from the Muslims, and then they made them exclusive, so that you could only join them if you were Christian. And of course that had the effect of freezing out other Jews and Muslims. Having said that, clearly it didn't always work, because even as late as 1492, at the end of the Reconquista, when Ferdinand and Isabella, the final conquering, and took over the palace of the Al-Jafariya palace in Zaragoza, they appointed a Muslim for life to be in charge of maintaining the Jafariya palace and all the palaces in the whole of Aragon. And the position then passed down to his son. Now, why would they do that? Well, because he was the best, And if you're the new ruler and you've got all the money, you want the best. You're just going to get the best no matter where they came from. So, although logically you'd find that strange, but I don't think they did find it strange, because they just wanted the best, and that was the end of the matter. And of course, the person who was the best was very happy to work now for new rulers, because he still had to feed his family, and I mean, he wasn't going to refuse. He was just going to use his skills, but in a different context. I mean, just actually one thing to point out, that the same thing in reverse, if you like, going right back to Umayyad times in Damascus. So the Umayyad mosque in Damascus, when the Umayyads came in and took Damascus as their capital, they didn't have top craftsmen at that time, back in the 7th century. So they would have used local Byzantine Christian craftsmen to do most of the top quality work there. So all the mosaics in the Umayyad mosque will have been done by Byzantine Christians. But they're now working for Muslim masters. So instead of doing their saints and biblical scenes like they would normally have been doing, they do visions of the Islamic paradise instead. But, they're top people. They can do top work to a different specification for a new master. It's the same thing in reverse that then happens in Andalusia when there's the change of power.
Yes. My name is Isam. I'm working from Kuwait. You mentioned that Islamic civilization had influenced the Christian civilization, especially in architectural aspect. My understanding, I don't know whether if you agree or not, that Islamic architects or art or craftsmen is very calm and soft, especially in the outer facade of their building. Normally they emphasize on the inner facade and the courtyard, the Islam. This is, I believe, their concept in all buildings or historical places they did, or palaces. Where the Christian civilization, I believe yet, they are more, their architect is, or craftsmanship is more detailed. And you can notice that in their cathedrals or Gothic design. Is that so?
Well,
it's what I meant to say. They carry out or continue what they learn from the Islamic, and then they did it, and unfortunately maybe they did it aggressively, especially in architects with so much detail.
well, but the same...
It came from the Islam point of view, or the Islamic, because Islam is meant to be relaxing for the human being. That's why their architects, they emphasize on making it soft and calm, not so detailed.
Well, I'm not so sure actually about that as a general point, because I mean, think of that that carved ivory pyxis that I showed. That's incredibly detailed and intricate, and there are examples both in the woodwork, which I've shown, again very detailed, very concentrated, if you like. I mean, it couldn't be much more detailed and concentrated in pure Islamic art. So I think you're thinking of things like large courtyards and things like that. But I mean, if you think of the Cordoba Mesquita, for example, the exterior is very, very carved. With every gate is covered in details and things. So I think maybe
not yet as much as the cathedral, the Christian cathedral, right? Still.
Well. I mean, some of the cathedrals have a lot of. I mean, Lincoln has got an exceptional, west front, which is very, very detailed. But I do see examples of that in Islamic architecture as well. I think it probably, that sort of thing maybe just reflects the taste of the bishop, or because.
I do really appreciate that you are emphasizing on history and how important is the history and the architect. And now history is considered one of the most important science in the world. And I'm sure you can be learned by everybody, whatever his standard of education, and he can enjoy all aspects of life. Thank you very much for your lecture. It was very interesting.
Abdullah?
Hello, Professor. Thank you very much for your lecture, which we very much enjoyed. I had a question regarding the Gothic period, the Palais des Papes in Avignon. I was wondering whether that was influenced by Islamic art.
Absolutely, he employed,
Right.
and it's known that Muslim craftsmen helped build that. I mean,
Wasn't that ironic, though? Catholic.
the Pope,
Yes.
I know,
Yes.
I know.
That was just.
Yeah.
I was actually quite curious about that, so I needed to hear it from yourself.
No, it's mentioned and there are images of it in the Stealing from the Saracens book.
Right.
There's an image of the Palais des Papes,
Right.
and I mention it again. You'll find it in the index of both books.
Okay.
Yes, so
Good.
the indexes of both books, by the way, are very detailed. I did them myself, and so I wanted them to be able to be used as reference books so that you can look for a specific building to see if it's mentioned there, or even specific themes I put in the index to try to make it as accessible as possible.
My other question was regarding the fact that they were built or influenced by Islamic art. For political reasons, were they scared, or religious reasons, to actually, let's say, inform the public, the society back then, was very rigid, that these were influenced by Islamic art, architects?
I don't think it would have crossed their mind. I think
No.
we're looking at it with our lens.
Right.
At that time, I don't think they thought about it. They just wanted the best.
They wanted the best, but they did not want to say that was influenced by Islamic
No,
art,
no,
right?
No. I mean, and there's a lot of ignorance too,
Yes.
of course, don't forget. So, one of the best examples of that, I always think, is the whole thing about the use of Arabic script,
Right.
which was bishops, had it round the hems of their beautiful garments and
Yes.
things, because they thought it was the language of Christ, and so
Right.
they thought it embellished their robes to have Arabic script
Indeed.
running all around.
Indeed.
Having honestly had no idea that.
Absolutely.
And that's why you find Kufic script in France, especially
Yes.
in some of the cathedrals.
Yes. Yes, indeed. Thank you very much, Professor. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Salsabil. Thank you so much for your work. So I'm originally Algerian, and I grew up with a deep admiration for Islamic architecture. And growing up in England, I've been to cathedrals, and I've often thought to myself, there's something that feels familiar about this, but I don't know what it is. But something that I've experienced in both mosques and cathedrals, and indeed in many of the photos that you've shared, is that sense of awe and peace and tranquility. And in so much of Gothic or Neo-Gothic architecture, there is the sublime that architects go for. And I wondered, in your opinion, was it just that stonemasons and engineers from the Islamic world were just the best, or was there a sense of the sublime that Western people were seeking? And to what extent is the Islamic architecture influence in Europe down to that pursuit of the sublime, not just the quality?
Yes, I know what you mean. I think it's a sort of harmony which comes across, a kind of rhythm almost in the patterns which I see and which I feel too. As you enter a cathedral, as you enter a beautiful older mosque. Unfortunately, I mean, more modern mosques, I feel have kind of lost it a bit, in this sort of desire to be, the sort of gulfy mosques, the bigger, at the expense of the sense of the sublime, as you talked. It's very difficult to get a sense of the sublime in such an environment, actually. But it's I feel that at the root of Islamic architecture is this sort of desire to be in harmony with nature, And so the rhythms of nature, and I think that's what's sort of speaking to us in those patterns. That's how I feel it anyway.
First of all, as a Syrian, I'm very grateful for your lecture today with the references to lots of like Syrian architecture. I know probably my question is not related to the lecture, but you mentioned that you came from Damascus. Is your next book influenced by where you were? Just out of curiosity.
Yes, I am. I am working on a new book on Damascus and have been since 2017. So yes is the answer.
Name is Nicholas Brett. Thank you very much for your lecture. When you mentioned the water wheels, the Roman water wheels, they were used in Roman times. The Romans were using pumps. So what you've got, in fact, some of the water wheels were 300, 400, 500 years. So things like Roman engineering would have come through to the Islamic age, and also when you have the tapered structures in terms of load, that's also a Roman thing. I mean, if you go to Dover, if you ever become mad and want to do something stupid, if you go to Dover and see the lighthouse, it is a stepped structure. So as a lot of stuff came from Rome, like fountains as well, because that's obviously mentioned in the Quran. It's just that that never got translated back into where it came from.
No, that's absolutely right. And of course it goes, in most cases, it goes further back than Rome too.
Yeah.
I mean, Rome did not invent everything, and neither did Greece,
Yeah.
Greece took much of its scholarship from further east, and people are starting to realise that now too. So it's a continuum, yes, and it goes right back to the beginnings of civilization, really, and progresses through. And you're right, yes, of course the Romans did invent, they carried on. Of course, that's the other thing. We think Roman equals Europe, but most of a huge amount of the Roman Empire was actually in what we would call the East, and many of the inventions get called Roman when in fact, they were from the Eastern Mediterranean. So that the Eastern Mediterranean has always produced a lot of innovation, unquestionably going back as far as you can, as far as is recorded. So that's absolutely right. I mean, I was brought up to, the education system I was brought up with taught me that Greece and Rome were the origin of all civilization. That was what we were all taught at school. And it was only when I switched to Arabic at university and then travelled to the Middle East for the first time that I began to realise that wasn't the full story. But what I'm saying in the book here is that it was via the Islamic world that these things re-entered Europe, because of course in the so-called Dark Ages all that knowledge was lost in Europe. I mean, Europe stagnated for much of that time, while the Islamic world was on the ascendant. So it was through the Islamic world, through Muslim Spain and Muslim Sicily above all, that the knowledge was refiltered into Europe, because it was never lost, as you say. I mean, the Islamic world continued and built on the Greek scholarship, the Roman scholarship, and developed it further, while Europe lost it. So yes, it's a continuum of it gets fed round and continues in that way.
Yeah, my name is Khizr Binder, and I'm basically a history graduate, and my scholarship, whatever research I have done, is very much related to the term called Islam's Golden Age. Some people have issue with this term, but basic question is that we see that in this era, it was basically fight between East and West. I mean, there were cultural exchanges as well, but the capture of Toledo in 1085, the reconquest by Normans of Sicily 1091, Jerusalem First Crusade, and then 9 Crusades until 1291 and all that. My question is that despite this ostentatious hostility, how the people here could have been allowed to do this, cultural exchange. I'm specifically referring to, you are referring to architecture. I'm particularly referring to a larger movement, Latin translation movement, when people like Plato of Rivoli, Constantine the African, Jared of Cremona, Abirald of Bath, they all, translated direct translated works of Arabic into Latin. The works, original Greek and Roman, which were translated during the Greco-Arabic translation movement between 750 and 950. So my question is, despite of this ostentatious hostility and crusades and all that, which particular agency within Christian West is should be credited with this all the translation and all the cultural things that they which we are mentioning in architecture, in terms of architecture? Is it clergy? Is it the monarch or the scholars? Who should be credited with this?
Yeah. Well, one of the things that became very clear in my research is that, as you rightly say, there was the school of translation in Toledo. And all these
Salerno
works, the Arabic knowledge and science was translated into Latin and therefore accessible for the first time. And it's very interesting that the monasteries in Spain and France talk about, at this period, I'm talking round about 1100 again, they start to have libraries, and they consider themselves very learned if they've got 200 or 300 Arabic manuscripts there in their libraries, when of course I think the Caliph in Cordoba had something like 10,000, is it, or 40,000, I can't remember, but vast numbers. But so the clergy at that time in the monasteries they realise basically that they can learn from this much more advanced civilization. And actually one of the key examples is a monk who went on to become the Pope, Sylvester II. He's sometimes called, what's he sometimes called, the scientific Pope or something like that. So he ran away from his monastery in northern France and went to study with a Saracen philosopher in Spain somewhere, and possibly in North Africa as well, in Kairouan, and learnt as much as he could from them, and was great friends with them, and became the most learned man of the age in Latin Christendom, and then went on to be Pope for about, not a very long time, but for a number of years at any rate. And he openly acknowledged that he got all this knowledge from Muslim scholars by going and studying with them. But I have been struck by the fact that when you travel to Spain and you buy the little booklet in the monastery, and it talks about the wonderful library and all the things that, and how learned these monks were, there is no mention of where this knowledge came from. And it's one of the things that annoys me rather, and I sort of feel the need to point out that, you didn't come up with this stuff yourself. You got it from the more advanced Muslim culture that predated you, and then, yes, you've developed it more and passed it on, but, it would be nice to have some sort of acknowledgement of that.
So clergy, basically. Clergy should be credited. Thank you. Thank you very much.
So my name is Abdurrahman, I'm from Kuwait. So you beautifully noted that the water, the zigzag designs come from ancient Egyptian hieroglyphs. And I hope you're successful in changing Romanesque to Islamesque.
Yeah.
But
I
do you
to enter the English dictionary as a new word, yes.
But do you think 100 years from now, someone's going to try and change Islamesque to, let's say, Egyptesque or some earlier civilization?
No.
Good.
No. I don't think so. No, I think Islamesque is a very broad term. It's covering geographically all of the Mediterranean, really, and even into Baghdad, and the styles that came out of there. So it's a pretty huge geographic area. And I think it's more accurate anyway than Romanesque.
Do you see a difference between Arabesque and Islamesque?
Oh yes, yes. I mean, arabesque is a well-known word that again was only actually created in I think it was the 16th century in Italy by art scholars there. So it's a kind of Renaissance term actually, but it purely applies arabesque to the endlessly flowing scrolls of vegetation and patterns that continue without end. That's the specific. That's why they're called. I mean, that is noted as a particularly Arab or Islamic characteristic, that this thing of the endlessness, the infinity, if you like, of the pattern. So that's completely different to Islamesque.
Well, thank you so much, Professor. Please join me in thanking Professor Darke. We realize she must be exhausted by now. She has had a very long trip yesterday and standing for quite a while now, but it was much appreciated. Thank you so much, Professor, for being with us tonight. It was such a fascinating talk. As you can see through many of our events and many of our projects that we do at Al-Furqan, we are trying to re-establish this cycle of civilization, being one world and human civilization. And just briefly on the translation movement, we have had a symposia on translation movement, including the first translation movement, the so-called the second, the third. We are doing another round of that symposia in November, hopefully, and hopefully we'll keep you updated on that, which looks at this story of how civilizations were, influenced by, each other and how they built, and it's a cumulative effort, and that's what we are trying to establish through many of these events. Thank you so much for being with us tonight. It has been a great pleasure. We hope to see you again in our future events, and thanks to the Al-Furqan team as well for bringing things together. Thank you. Have a good evening, and don't miss the chance to get a signed book from Professor Darke.